Welcome to Mandates and Megaphones, hosted by Jeremy Maggs, unpacking the politics, promises and power plays behind the G20 summit.
Hello and welcome to Mandates and Megaphones here on Moneyweb in association with Standard Bank. I'm Jeremy Maggs, and as the country prepares to host world leaders, our politics and foreign policy messaging obviously under global scrutiny. And domestic coalition dynamics, economic fragility, contested narratives all colliding with ambitions to lead in the global south. Now, I think few observers track and challenge the space with the sharpness of today's guest. Ferial Haffajee is one of the country's leading political writers, an associate editor at the Daily Maverick. And her work, I think, explains those links, those deep links between politics, diplomacy, national credibility and narrative power. So let's get into the conversation. Ferial, a very warm welcome to you. And let me start with an easy one. When South Africa takes the G20 stage, is there a single story you think that we want the world to believe about us?
Definitely, Jeremy. I was at the Union buildings on Sunday looking at them, putting up all the G20 insignia and banners, etc. And I thought it's very clear to me that the kind of message we want to put forward is that we are a country on our continent, so the African agenda, very clear to me. And we've also set ourselves up as the polar opposite of a rising conservatism, what's broadly called the anti-woke agenda, the anti-DEI agenda. If you look at the three key themes of the G20, they are the opposite of where other...
You talk about Africa, which is important, yes. But how much of the story that we're going to tell is genuinely about South Africa and how much is positioned more as an African story? Difficult, surely, to find that balance because of so many different competing narratives.
So I'm very interested in what Trevor Manuel and his team, the work, the panel, the report they've presented, which is the cornerstone of the African agenda, and that is about rising African debt across the continent and also the cost of capital. That would include items very dear to the hearts, for example, of the CEO of Standard Bank, Sim Shabalala, and that is, what do the ratings agencies, are they fair to our continent? Are they reflecting its potential and its growth story effectively enough? So I do think that that's been a cornerstone of over 150 meetings that have been held in this year that South Africa has been chairperson of the G20 group, and it will emerge there. Obviously, there are things that are South Africa specific that we want to highlight in the 2 days, and that would be, I guess, clean energy, and it would be trade with the EU, trade with the US, but also trade on the African continent. Big three issues there.
Ferial, South Africa wants to project stability, obviously. It also wants to project leadership. It wants to project purpose. But at home, we face a lot of coalition uncertainty, infrastructural difficulties, intense economic stress. Difficult, surely, to reconcile the story we want the world to hear with the reality that you and I live in every single day.
Perhaps, but maybe let's just travel a little further afield and see how we might look if you don a different pair of spectacles. So, for example, last year I went to Dar es Salaam, and I really thought, wow, this is a story of continent rising. You know, its growing prosperity was so clear and so visceral, from the buildings, from the bus rapid transport system, from everything I was seeing. It felt like a place that was being modernized and growing. Fast forward to today, a disastrous election and mass protests on the street, the same roads that we had traveled on, now no-go areas, with protesters burning those very same bus rapid transport system stations I'd been marveling at. What we do have going for us, I think, is a story of stability. And of course, because we tell the granular story of the commissions of inquiry into rotten police, we tell the story of massive protests, and I tell the story almost every day of what's happening in Johannesburg. The bigger picture, I think, is of a fairly stable African democracy.
Amplify that for me a little bit when you talk
Sure.
about stability. What type of stability are we talking about, and how fragile is it, do you think?
So at the weekend, the president called a meeting of the fractious government of national unity. As he said, as he told our colleague Mandy Wiener, there's no magic in this GNU, unlike the first one many years ago, which he and Ruth Meyer loved so much. But it has withstood. I've counted about 19 times where it could have ended, and we've written headlines that GNU in the balance, GNU about to collapse. He called a meeting at the cradle of humankind to try and shore up the image that this GNU will present to the world. It's a government of national unity made up of 10 parties. So very concerned there that we don't emerge on those 2 days in November as squabbling and squalling as the GNU has done for much of its short life.
So how difficult do you think it's going to be to balance the politics of solidarity with economic pragmatism?
So I think they're going to do it. If you saw a couple of weeks ago, I think it was underplayed by us in the media. John Steenhuisen was in China. He inked a massive deal for pitted fruit. So peaches, plums, apricots may well hold one of the keys to ensuring that our agriculture sector doesn't suffer too much because of US trade tariffs being put on them, and possibly the end of the AGOA agreement in a year's time. I think that was really important. So I think you are going to see quite a bit of buy-in. What happens once the G20 leaders jet off, I think the jury's out there, because the next year is going to be one of great instability and I think a lot of political change in our country.
And that's exactly it. There is a risk that the global messaging and the view that we want to put out is maybe being written a little faster than our ability to deliver real proof points at home. So what I'm hearing you say is it's all very well to present this unified message on the stage over 2 days, but it's what comes afterwards.
It's whether it is sustained. I mean, I watch Operation Vulindlela very closely, like you. I think that we're seeing real an energy revolution happening in front of our eyes, especially with the lifting of the cap on private power production. Barbara Creasy is doing a magnificent job at transport, and it's a difficult sector. Yes, you'll still see that our ports are very poor performers, but I think that you're seeing reforms which if they are sustained through the period we're going to come in, should bear fruits for us, as I think we've seen. Load shedding was the biggest issue ahead of the election in 2024, and while there's still big power cuts in Joburg, there isn't scheduled national load shedding, which ripped the heart of any sort of growth. Ultimately, I think we count these things in growth and jobs, and those, of course, we haven't seen those coming through at all.
Farah, let's talk a little bit about Johannesburg. And before our conversation was, before we started taping it, I was teasing you about wandering around Johannesburg, counting potholes. Maybe I was being a little bit unfair and disingenuous. But the reality is, do you think the city is ready in terms of infrastructure and reliability? You've written extensively about urban breakdown, and we're a showcase now. What worries you the most?
So I think for the G20, you've seen real steps taken. I was interested listening to a water briefing by the mayor last week, where he let slip that the president had called him on his cell phone. So this is President Mayor saying, I've driven here and it's looking terrible. So they got a team in there. So I think on the route, if you drive the G20 route, I'm going to do it night and day this week. There've been discernible improvements. The rather old-fashioned Nasrec has been changed, and I'd love to go and see that. That's where the actual meetings are going to be. So for the whole year, if you chat to people in the Treasury, Reserve Bank, DIRCO, etc., we've showed off our best. We've taken people to the best places South Africa can offer, and I think showed the best of us, and I hope that's going to happen. Whether these are sustainable changes for the city, that's our work to do week by week by week, to see whether people have electricity, water, whether Kenny Konene continues to make the improvements that we're seeing in traffic systems. be that robots or be they road markings, which really have been improved. And I don't know in your area, but certainly where I live.
Difficult, though, for us to claim any kind of moral authority when we still battle crime, corruption, and the kind of infrastructural instability that you've just referred to.
True. I think we've climbed up the corruption rankings. My consideration or study right now is that while the Zondo Commission of Inquiry was meant to escort us out of the era of state capture, in fact, what the other two commissions are showing us is a deepening criminalization of the state. And we could spend at least an hour talking about what that means and how it looks. But where I do think we can claim a support for the international systems of justice is with our ICJ case on Palestine, and also how we support multilateralism and support the UN systems in a time where many governments are riding roughshod over them. So I think on the latter, we're looking good, on the former, not so much.
Let's widen the scope of this conversation
Sure.
a little bit and talk about South Africa's role in the global south. Do you think our foreign policy voice is one that's trusted?
So there's an interesting grouping that I've been studying or trying to watch, is this idea of the middle powers. And the middle powers are not the superpowers. So it would include Europe, it would include big countries like Brazil, like Indonesia. There's about 20 odd of them. And in that grouping, which I see emerging as a very interesting, they're not a bloc yet, they're not like BRICS at all. I think there South Africa certainly has a voice that's well listened to. And if you're looking for local examples of that, would be the various agreements and deals signed with the EU in the past while. Last week, you'd have seen the president was in Vietnam addressing the ASEAN countries. And it's those kind of places where I think South Africa has established itself as one of the global South countries which matter in the global debate.
How does the country then leverage that more to its advantage and the advantage of its neighbours?
Well, we have to, I suppose the first thing is that we're rapidly looking to diversify markets. So whether we're selling apples to Thailand, I want to see what comes out of the Vietnamese agreements, whether we make our African continental free trade area work much better than it does at the moment. These are the things that we'd have to count in the next 1 to 3 to 5 years.
How difficult do you think it's going to be to find or to bridge that gap between all this ambition that we've been talking about and the role that South Africa can play with actual execution? And maybe, perhaps more importantly, who does it?
So who does it is who's been doing it all year long. We have some really sharp thinkers at the National Treasury, at the Reserve Bank. I mean, I think it's not by accident that we got off the fat of grey list just ahead of the G20, the last set of meetings in France, and where the former Director General of the Treasury, Ismail Mamoniat, represented South Africa. So we've got really sharp, highly regarded bureaucrats and bankers, especially in the Reserve Bank. I'm quite keen to explore what they've been doing all year long. In DIRCO, I think that Zane Dango, the Director General, and the young Minister, Ronald Lamola, have been working hard all year. And so what we've done at the Maverick is we've gone to the embassies of all the G20 countries who've said they are going to come. America hasn't commented yet, as well as the AU and the EU. And the overriding message we're getting from them, Jeremy, is that in a very difficult year where everyone expected this G20 to be derailed completely, actually we've done decently.
One of the other issues that we've spent an inordinate amount of time talking about on this series is climate financing, which remains a sticking point. It's about who pays for the green transition, how developing nations avoid being punished for industrializing too late. The sense I'm getting is that we're not going to make a huge amount of progress on that particular front. Maybe you're hearing something different.
You know, I read last week, I know the money's taking a long time to come through, but Ursula von der Leyen of the EU She said that the 12.5 billion euro, which is significant, is flowing, and the taps have been opened a little bit wider after the meeting last week. I was also really interested to read that the CBAM, that's the border adjustment mechanism, which really could hurt our motor industry if it doesn't shift quickly, that has been delayed by a year, which gives us breathing space to make some of these transition measures. Then perhaps the best place I follow, I'm sure you do too, is Engineering News, where Terence Creamer has been writing extensively about how South Africa's electricity trading market, the one that's not yet the formal Eskom-led market, is really showing the future, that this is where the future of industrialization and growth lies. It's in deals like you saw between Glencore and Discovery Green a fortnight ago. That's where we're going to see this transition happening in real time and with real money.
The question, of course, is whether developing countries can still industrialize responsibly without being locked out.
Absolutely, and I think that 1 year is really going to require us to move pretty fast. I'd like to see how our EV plans, our electric vehicle plans, are going to work more quickly than they are. Will the industry respond? What does it need to respond? But what concerns me, Jeremy, is almost as soon as the G20 is finished, then we're going to have this very destabilizing ANC National General Council. And I read quite buried, but it was there in the Sunday Times, that maybe, just maybe, President Ramaphosa is going to say, after what I hope will be a successful G20, right, I'm done, I'm out of there, you guys slug it out.
And if that happens, what does it mean?
I think it means that we see quite radical shifts in how the GNU is made. It's no secret that the deputy president of the ANC, who's likely to become its president, then chooses an alliance that may include the EFF and more radical populist parties, and then I think we're in a different kind of space.
Ferial, let's get back to the green economy and that important transition. And allied to that, I think, would be food security. And one of the issues that I've heard discussed is whether G20 nations are really serious about supporting Africa in this respect, supporting African agriculture, or is that just, I don't know, maybe just lip service until the next crisis?
Look, I mean, Europe is extremely protectionist of its farmers, and as that continent moves to the right, I was chatting to people who say it's incredibly difficult for progressive European diplomats who might want to strike these more conciliatory trade agreements and developmental trade agreements with the continent. Very difficult to get anything through because of the rising tide of conservatism across Europe. So I think it's going to be difficult, and that food security is certainly one of those key areas that I'm going to watch both at the Civil Society Summit and at the People's Gathering of the G20 at the Constitutional Court. There's two of them. I'm not sure how they're different from each other, but food security is going to be a big talking point along with debt levels. So
much to focus on and choose what to cover. It's going to be very, very difficult.
It's really going to be. We're meeting just now to put it all together.
And where exactly do we go? One of the other issues is AI regulation, which is emerging alongside AI competition, I guess.
Yes.
Again, we'll be watching to see whether the G20 can find any common ground. I think it's maybe over-egging it when we say there's the danger of a new digital Cold War, but this again is a very important issue and something which will need to be navigated very carefully.
I mean, isn't it just the story of our times that it may be one of those things that causes an even bigger divide than the digital divide we've been speaking about? I mean, it's shifting our worlds, it's shifting how all of us work, and it does. I mean, there are really interesting thinkers like Prof. Vukosi Marivate, who's who actively work to ensure that this divide, that we think about it well before we thought about the impact of big tech on Africa and the economies, and of how it would cause deeper underdevelopment. So I do think it'll come up. How much you can expect to come out of the G20, I'm not sure. The B20, that's the business 20, led by Phuthi Mahanyele of Naspers, has put out a very important paper, I thought, on how to deepen and cheapen connectivity, because obviously they see that as the way to leapfrog our continent and to ensure that it doesn't get left behind.
Let me ask you two more questions.
Yes.
And these are kind of broad canvas questions. One is, I think it's fair to say that trust generally in multilateral institutions is declining. Is there worry that the G20 could become as gridlocked perhaps as the United Nations is?
You know, I have to tell you that even making people interested has been such a tough job. I mean, you make everything interesting, so maybe your audience has stayed with you. Our G20 work has, and we've really tried. People are simply not engaged with it at all. And the reason I see for that is when we ask questions about food prices, electricity prices, do you have water? Even a relatively well-heeled audience like the Daily Maverick is suffering with those very basics. So then I think it just becomes pie in the sky. And support for multilateralism, engagement with even just a continent is difficult when actually you are totally absorbed in the day-to-day.
And just a final one, the African Union has a permanent G20 seat.
It does.
Critical that the continent turns symbolism into some kind of real leverage as quickly as possible. Do you think that's going to happen?
I think it's going to happen at the level of rhetoric, Jeremy. I do think the African free continental, the free trade area is going to be one of the big stories, as will debt relief, but I don't think you're going to see anything signed. In fact, I think you're going to have a chair's communique out of this G20 rather than a declaration of agreement or consensus. That's the best we can hope for at this point. And what's good is that Africa has a big seat at the table. I was really interested in the Afrobarometer survey of last week, showing that more people want leaders like Traore, or in our case, a General Mkhwanazi. They're preferring the return of the era of the strongman because the era of democracy simply hasn't worked. That for me was quite a difficult survey to read from Afrobarometer.
One more's just popped into my head, so let me ask it to you very quickly. And it's kind of a real headline question, though. But is there a single line, do you think, that South Africa needs to land on home soil?
I think it needs to land the story that Africa is a growing continent, and there's data to show that, and that South Africa is a stable and reliable trade partner and also a key supporter of multilateralism.
Ferial Hafaji, Associate Editor at the Daily Maverick, thank you so much indeed. Let me just try and get my head around this. I think what's clear from the conversation is that any kind of narrative without delivery is going to be pure theatre, and delivery without narrative has no audience. So go and figure that one out. South Africa's challenge is to, in this G20 moment, I think, is to align confidence with credibility, but also make sure that we demonstrate our ambition, and most important word there, I think, is execution. So that's it for this edition of Mandates and Megaphones, brought to you by Standard Bank here on Moneyweb. Thank you for listening. I'm Jeremy Maggs.
Thank you for listening to Mandates and Megaphones. You can find more episodes on moneyweb.co.za.